Over the weekend release of The Woman King, a call to boycott the movie risen across the whole interwebs, both coming from anti-slavery activists and white supremacists looking to exploit any avenue to suppress black representation in the media both. Somehow, this movie managed to offend and unite both extremes of the ideological debate. So what's up with that? I decided to look into this and dissected some key scenes in the movie and explored the creator's intentions and historical background and why Lupita Nyong'o of the Black Panther's Nakia, which featured the Dora Milaje all-female army, which partially drew its inspiration from the all-female unit of the Agojie from the Dahomey, decided to withdraw from the project after experiencing the legacy of the Woman King firsthand. Viola Davis starred as General Nanisca of an all-female unit of Agojie, who led the liberation of prisoners being sold to slavery to their rival Oyo Empire, and it was a massacre. The surprise night attack earned them a decisive victory, and Nanisca slit the throat of a man who denied taking slaves. On the surface, this opening scene of the movie was a great demonstration of pathos against the racially motivated transatlantic slave trade. Their victorious return was greeted by the citizens of Dahomey at the city gates. Now here's the thing. Historically, the Agojie themselves are also perpetrators of the very same practice of slavery that this movie intends to disavow. It's one thing to draw inspiration from historical atrocities to create something new. It's another to actually whitewash history and present it as something based on powerful true events as means to signal your virtue. Oh sure, it was a very fun and cinematic opening to a movie, with lots of pathos for sure. And it was a long journey to get this movie made, which the promotional tour have focused on. In 2015, actress, producer, and writer Maria Bello wrote the screenplay with Dana Stevens, who quickly won over Viola Davis to produce, star, and promote the project. Back then, studio heads were reluctant to fund a black action movie rooted in African history. Until a black action movie rooted in African history broke the box office in 2018 and got nominated for the Oscars. Wakanda forever! Black Panther took over the Marvel fandom by storm, and racist white supremacists needed it to fail, so they resorted to calling it a bad movie and calling it a failure in the box office. Black Panther was so bad that it became the first superhero movie to nail a Best Picture nomination at the Oscar. Black Panther! It failed so hard that it even got a sequel. Good job, racists! And fans swooned over Lupita Nyong'o's portrayal of Nakia, and quickly they recruited her to play the part of the Agojie warrior that inspired the Dora Milaje. But then something dawned on her. We'll get back to that later. Anyway, the director, Gina Prince-Bythewood, likened The Woman King with Braveheart, a self-proclaimed historical movie infamous for its whitewashed historical inaccuracy, which kinda explained all the complaints that this movie's been getting. Anyway, if you're curious about the historical issues with Braveheart, go see the video by Historical Buff's channel. For our purposes, suffice to know that they couldn't even get the dates right in that movie, and even the kilts. Scots aren't supposed to be wearing kilts at this time. Well, what's more frustrating is that The Woman King is the movie that Viola Davis depended on for the Battle of the Soul of Hollywood.
So if you don't come see it, then you're sending a message that black women cannot lead the box office globally.
Braveheart was a 5 Oscar certified garbage. But she was right about one thing. It's about time that we have a movie in the global box office with a black woman lead, especially one with a black people history. The modern world is as much shaped with what happened in Africa over the past 500 years. And the kingdom of Dahomey is unique in that it's a proper kingdom, even if it is a tributary one, instead of the modern stigma of poor African being enslaved by warlords taking advantage over tribes. And the movie really showed how cinematic African costume design and life from this era can be. And John Boyega, playing King Ghezo, as if demanding the audience to, commanded the Portuguese slave trader to speak our language. But he himself is not at the top of the food pyramid, no. Above him is Oba Ade of the Kingdom of Oyo, King Ghezo's suzerain, of which he owes a constant tribute of guns and slaves, and an ally to the Western white slavers. And this version of Ghezo, with a heavy heart, participated in supplying slaves. And this became the moral center of the movie, as Nanisca opposed the king in engaging with such immoral slave trade. A bunch of people online who are claiming that this movie glorified slave trade apparently never saw this film or watched it with their mind firmly closed. This sort of moral dilemma is what makes Star Trek interesting. Beside the moral issue of an African kingdom conducting raids on behalf of their white slave traders, the fact that this movie is fronted by a woman lead proper and not just a quote-unquote strong female character who's actually just a suspect fronted by misogynists such as Sarah Connor, Ripley, Lara Croft, and The Bride. These are not quote strong female character such as Sarah Connor, Ripley, Lara Croft, and The Bride. These are not quote strong female character. The identity of a character absolutely matters to the story, be that skin color, gender, sexual orientation, or what have you. But not for these characters. They're just female substitute for any random strong character usually occupied by foul-mouthed masculinity.
Stay thy hand, fair prince.
Who said I'm fair?
The story they occupy absolutely was not influenced by their identity. It doesn't matter that they're female or not, making their identity irrelevant.
Not to be.
Thus, they're not good example of strong female character. But here's another example. The orphan Nawi, given to the Agojie after refusing to marry and formed a bond with Niska, was very well acted. The sisterhood of the warriors is something that we really should have seen on a lot of stories. But given our social circumstances, it felt like a breakthrough. This sisterhood bond then came into play when Nawi was captured by the Oyo. That led Niska to take the kingdom into war. While the action scenes proved satisfying, less so was the casus belli of the war, with the movie virtue signaling fidelity towards historical accuracy while misrepresenting a historically slave-trading kingdom as some sort of champion for proto-Pan-African struggle for the abolition of slavery.
I really hate that man.
But whatever. Anyway, at least they've alluded to Dahomey's participation in the transatlantic slave trade. It's just that it would be nice if this were discussed in a more in-depth manner, instead of just painting the Oyo as the ultimate end-all be-all slave trader enabler. Especially that the Oyo slave port of Ouida was actually under Dahomey control from 1727 to 1892, which runs against the pathos of Niska screaming to burn the whole trade to the ground on the big battle at the port. And this went on with a moving speech that painted Dahomey as a champion of abolition and the future suffering of slaves traded through the Middle Passage. I mean, really, the history of the Middle Passage is something that the popular discourse has fallen behind on. Wally Kosola, one of the last surviving victims of the slave trade, whose history was recorded in 1928, only to sit in storage for almost a century, was only published in 2018, the same year that Black Panther was released. He was taken from his village by the very same Dahomey soldiers who ransacked this village and decapitated the king, and Kosola remembered the elite soldier of the Agojie. No man can be so strong like the woman soldier from the Dahomey, he said, describing their violent treatment of those injured in the raid. Too unspeakable to describe here for this video. YouTube censorship is unbearable sometimes. This black-faced whitewashing of the Dahomey atrocities is akin to the whitewashing of the atrocities committed by the Spaniards under Christopher Columbus in the movie 1942, Conquest of Paradise, where Columbus actually engaged in sexual trafficking. And that's just the, quote, lesser atrocities that he committed. Also discussed at great length on the History Buff channel, if you want to know about it. This is especially a slap in the face when the movie bills itself as based on powerful true events. The historical King Ghezo did not engage in slave trade reluctantly. When the British abolished slavery in 1833 and finally pressured King Ghezo to end it in 1852, he conceded and promised to do so, but continued the practice a mere 5 years later. Ghezo told the British, quote, "The slave trade has been the ruling principle of my people. It is the source of their glory and wealth. Their songs celebrate their victories, and the mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery." King Ghezo. Why are we making this movie again? The historical defeat of the Oyo resulted in an increase of slave exports through Ouida. Ghezo even gave a 6-year-old girl for Queen Victoria. All of this with unwavering support from his Agojie harem. It's great if you want to make a fictional fantasy out of a historical soldier. The Dora Milaje from Black Panther did that very well. But it's a historical conceit to whitewash historical atrocities and present it as powerful true events. And this is what's so ironic about this movie. For a long time now, white supremacists have used the Dahomey's reputation for violence as evidence that these black slaves aren't exactly irreproachable victims, but they were also perpetrators of slavery, even the claim that by buying slaves sold to the kingdom, these white slavers were actually rescuing these people from human sacrifice, which, infuriatingly, in reality, their violent tendencies is nothing compared to Western imperial slavery. Because on the other side of the Atlantic, descendants of these slaves are still, to this day, fighting to have their voice heard, let alone equal treatment. Ironically, when all is said and done, should the filmmaker choose to include all the aforementioned dark history of the Dahomey, it would have added extra dimension and depth to the discourse on the morality of slavery that the characters are struggling against in the middle of this morality tales on slavery that this movie wanted to champion. Perhaps the worst part is the social implication of this whitewashing of history, when thousands of Western period dramas have ignored historical fidelity, such as what they did with Columbus and Wallace. Where were all these people who called for the boycott of the woman king back then? Why was there no calls for boycotts for these whitewashed historical films that glorified slavery? Especially for 1492, which literally glorified slavery. Why should a movie with a female black lead be held to higher historical moral standards than those other movies? Or rather, why are we so strictly loose when white supremacists whitewash their own history instead? Well, truthfully, we know the answer to that the descendants of these slaves brought over to the New World are still fighting to have their voice heard, let alone equal treatments. And not surprisingly, the social implications are clear. The conservatives seized this historical weakness with the film to delegitimize the social movement to rectify the errors of whitewashed slavery and deemed it hypocritical when black perpetrators of slavery are being portrayed as heroes, as if two wrongs make a right. On the surface, The Woman King is the kind of movie that promised to deliver an engaging anti-slavery movie. And my guess is that this was what excited Lupita Nyong'o to join the project after her stellar performance in Black Panther. Cast as Navi, she even went to Benin and shot a documentary on the Agojie that partially inspired the Dora Milaje of the Black Panther. Starry-eyed, she began the documentary with excitement and curiosity. She even met the current king of Dahomey, witnessed the actual Agojie dance performed for generations, and witnessed the actual throne of King Ghezo, the very throne that John Boyega sit in the movie. And to this day, King Ghezo's throne is sitting on the skulls of the very people that were killed. See those skulls? These were erased from the Woman King.
I mean, wow, you know.
Lupita then continued to learn about the history of the Agojie, how some women would volunteer to join, others would have been forcibly recruited to a harsh life that would have hardened any heart or suffered death.
As I've learned more about the female fighters, I've realized just how formidable they must have been to withstand the life they were handed. But any notion of the Agojie warriors being a beacon of enlightened feminism, like the Dora Milaje of Wakanda, has long gone.
In 1892, the French destroyed the Agojie. Out of 12,000 warrior women, it is estimated that no more than 60 survived. But the legacy is very much alive. Lupita met with the descendants of the last Agojie. Even though the women army was officially disbanded centuries ago, a living descendant is still very much alive. Lupita had the opportunity to meet with a woman with the mark of an Agojie. She was trained by the original Agojie and declared an Amazon by the king. Her mother, as an Agojie, died in the palace, and Lupita asked if she was scared when they started training or did she like it. "I was happy," she said, "because if the king put you in charge of something, you had to do it." It's amazing to learn that even in Benin, this last Agojie is a secret.
This astonishing woman has been hidden inside the palace since her childhood, regarded by the king as a symbol of Dahomey's independence in defiance of French imperial rule.
Only a few people know of her existence. This secrecy is a reminder of the shadow that the colonial era cast on Benin's history. Then Lupita met a woman whose grandmother was taken by the Agojie from Nigeria. "I can tell you my family history," she said. "My mother was from Nigeria." One morning, the warrior women, the Agojie, came to her village and took a lot of people. These women were very strong. They scream at you. You have to follow them immediately. And when they get angry at you, they just kill you. Grandmother was going to fetch water when the Agojie took her. She was a teenager. She went with many people to fetch water. She wasn't the only one they took. They took the whole group and brought them here. Lali's Yoruba grandmother, Yaga, was abducted in Nigeria by the Agojie warriors and trafficked to the Dahomey kingdom. Yaga never saw her family again. Yaga was sold to a Portuguese trader, Lima, Lali's grandmother. "What the Agojie did was not good at all," she said. "Not good at all. They took my grandmother, they sold her, and now I'm here. I don't know my aunts. I don't know anybody from my mother's family. I never talk about my feelings to my children. It's too sad."
We've been going around praising all the Agojie left, right, and center, singing their praises, invoking their spirits. And yet your history, your people are victims to something they did. How can you reconcile that in your head?
A few months after the release of this documentary, Lupita Nyong'o quietly left the Women King.
I can't see
There was no explanation as to the reason for her departure.
The role of fantasy is to create the heroes that we cannot have in the real world. Because people are complicated.
At the end of the day, the accusation that this movie glorified slavery is factually untrue. In fact, it went to great lengths and passionately delivered its pathos of anti-slavery message at the expense of historical accuracy. They did it by whitewashing an elite group of soldiers who committed the very same atrocities. At the end of the day, this is just some Braveheart class movie wrapped in social justice marketing. There is nothing to get so worked up about, and just enjoy it if you can, and hope that the next one would be better. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.